So this is the third part to setting the foundations to Cook 1994. So I'm picking up from where I left off before. Universal grammar then, I'm here in the top right hand corner. Entails the set of universal principles of language, some of which are parametrized, so contain possibilities, contain settings. For example, we have the possibility for having a specific arrangement in sentences. Then, depending on the linguistic context that we are surrounded by, will we choose as the basic arrangement for sentences SVO or SOV, depending on what is it that we encounter the most frequently, the most commonly in the language that we were born into. The view of language acquisition in terms of parameter setting is the basis of current work in the generative tradition. So, Hageman says, human beings are born equipped with some internal, unconscious knowledge of grammar. This is UG. Internal, unconscious knowledge of grammar. UG is a set of universal principles of language. This is what you can read there in the top right-hand corner, some of which are parametrized via the input of the experience of one particular language. This knowledge, the one that is parametrized, can be implemented. The acquisition process is triggered by the exposure, the child's linguistic experience. For example, one of the parameters that we study is the pro-drop and non-pro-drop parameter. So we know that languages can be pro-drop or non-pro-drop. English being an example of a non-pro-drop language, Spanish being an example of a pro-drop language. So if we go to page now 27 in Cook's chapter, we'll see that Cook here, he postulates what the pro-drop parameter is. Page 27, right before the list of examples that he makes. He says, let us now look at some parameters. In English, declarative sentences must have grammatical subjects. Here we'll make, a specification, because when he says grammatical subjects, he mentions as an example of grammatical subjects the pronoun, the personal pronoun he, and then the pronouns, but here empty pronouns, expletive pronouns, it and there. We will only call grammatical subjects the subjects that are devoid of semantic load, devoid of meaning. That is to say, we'll only label grammatical subjects it when it is an expletive pronoun, expletive meaning without semantic content, and there when there is an expletive pronoun, not the adverb, but rather the pronoun that is used in existential sentences. Then the category grammatical will only be associated with grammatical subjects, that is, will only be associated in our chair with expletive pronouns, such as it and there. Now, we will not consider the pronoun, personal pronoun he, a grammatical subject in this respect. We'll consider it the syntactic subject, but this pronoun is a personal pronoun, therefore it has semantic load. It has meaning of its own, different from it in it's raining, and different from there in there's a book on the table. Now, in contrast to what we see in the English examples, we have in Spanish, va a casa, llueve, hay un libro en la mesa. So we have sentences without an explicit subject. In va a casa, we can understand that we're speaking about he or she, for that matter. We need more information, but the inflections in the verb ir in the form of va can allow us to recover the entity that we are referring to. It is a third person singular entity, a he or a she. This is different, so here we can understand that there is a person involved in this situation. The thing is that the sentence does not show explicitly this person by means of a pronoun, but it is accessible by the inflections that the verb ir takes. Now, in contrast, we know that in llueve, it's raining, and hay un libro en la mesa, there's a book on the table. We're not speaking of an agent. We're not speaking of a person doing anything. But in fact, llueve is an impersonal sentence in Spanish because it has no possibility for us to associate this to a person doing the action. And the same situation takes place with hay un libro en la mesa. This is an existential sentence in Spanish, but it is una oración impersonal de verbo haber. No hay ninguna persona que ejecuta o que está detrás de la situación representada por el verbo haber. So, the focus for the time being, because there's a lot to say with respect to these sentences, but for the time being, the focus is that they differ with respect to the pro-drop parameter. Some languages, such as Spanish, Italian, Chinese, and Arabic, permit sentences without subjects, right? Be these subjects expletive or not, okay? So there's no equivalent in llueve to what we see in English realized as it. There's no equivalent in Spanish, hay un libro en la mesa, to what we see in English realized as there. All right? And then, of course, there's no equivalent in Spanish. In va a casa, we don't have the need, the obligation to explicitly specify él o ella va a casa, although we can do so. But still, va a casa is grammatical, meaning is possible in Spanish. In contrast, we cannot say in English, is going home, right? We are obliged to specify explicitly the subject pronoun, in this case, he. Now I can continue a few more minutes. So, in languages like Italian, finite verbs such as va or habla in this sentence here, meaning verbs that carry present or past tense, can have either an overt subject or a null pro-subject. So we can have María parla españolo, o María habla español, o parla españolo, o habla español. Perdón por mi italiano, but I'm doing my best. Now, conventionally designated, pro is a null subject pronoun. So, meaning there can be a pronoun. We can have ella habla español, right? But we can also have the possibility of saying, of producing a grammatical sentence in Spanish or Italian by saying habla español without the specification of the pronoun or the full noun phrase that refers to the agent, Maria. We can say habla español and still make sense and still produce a grammatical sentence in Spanish. In English, we cannot normally have an all pro subject. We cannot have speak Spanish in the same way that we couldn't have before is going home. So, Spanish allows for overt, so there's a problem there, overt, and here we could better exemplify the point in focus by having ella. Elided, so not Maria but ella. We can have habla español without the specification of the pronoun, and when we don't have the specification of the pronoun, what we have is this null subject, not explicit at the level of the language realization, but we know it exists, for we know that somebody does the speaking and that this verb shows agreement with a specific type of person, right? Third person singular entity. In contrast, in English, we cannot have this possibility. This is not possible in English. This is not grammatical in English. Therefore, getting back to what we were saying before, Spanish allows for either an overt or a null subject. In contrast, English, with finite verbs, we generally have only an overt subject. Okay? Now, we will not tackle this parameter, but there is a parameter in focus here, the allowing or disallowing for null subjects with finite verbs in declarative sentences in languages, in this case Spanish and English. Now, the invitation to go to Cook 28 to acknowledge the existence of different ways, so the way different languages arrange constituents in a sentence, is also believed to be parametrized, to be, ruled by language-specific parameters or language-specific settings, for that matter, going by the reasoning set forth in Cook. He speaks of different settings for the parameters, so this is a parameter, opacity, that has to do with how languages arrange constituents in a sentence. Whether a setting is permitted or not, disallowed, will depend on the setting being one way or some other way in the language. So the exemplification he gives is that in the sentence, I am reading from page 28 in Cook's material, we cannot have the possibility in English to say John drinks not wine, but rather what we need to have in English, if we want to have the negative variant of the declarative sentence in question, we must choose an auxiliary verb that precedes the particle, the negative particle not. In contrast, in French, we have Jean ne boit pas de vin, or something along those lines. The negative pas follows the main verb instead of preceding it. The other negative element na indeed precedes the verb, but is often left out in colloquial French. So what the focus is here is that pas, the obligatory negative marker, follows the main verb. In English, in order for us to have a negative sentence, we must have auxiliary verb and negative particle preceding, right, the main verb, drink in this case. So, opacity parameter, we will not choose this term opacity, but we will refer to the languages that we study, showing specific arrangements, specific basic, canonical meaning the most basic, the most frequent arrangement of constituents in their sentences. In French, as we saw, the negative particle follows the main verb. In English, the negative particle precedes it. Okay? So this is what happens the most frequently in one and the other language, and this is what parameters, are about. They are concerned with what happens the most canonically, the most frequently in languages, the most unmarkedly in languages. They help form what is known as the core grammar of languages.